nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Gidello.
This week, America's role in brokering peace in the Middle East, and is a top secret weapon making diplomats and spies sick?
Plus, confusion reigns after officials tell vaccinated people to take off their masks. And are we about to learn the truth behind UFO sightings? Let's get into it.
After a week and a half of conflict, Israel and Hamas agreed to an unconditional ceasefire earlier today in a truce brokered by neighbouring Egypt. The United States had been placing increasing pressure on Israel to end their 11-day aerial bombardment of Gaza in retaliation for Hamas rocket attacks. President Biden has been working the telephone rather than reaching for the microphone, relying on his decades of personal contacts. But this seemingly low-key prod seems to have had a major impact.
The president conveyed to the prime minister that he expected a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was reportedly taken aback by that, not the unconditional support that he'd enjoyed from Biden's predecessor. As recently as yesterday, the Israeli leader was leaving the option open of an invasion and occupation of Gaza to oust Hamas.
You can either conquer them, and that's always an open possibility, or you can deter them. And we are engaged right now in forceful deterrence, but I have to say, we don't rule out anything.
And those comments too probably helped to prod Hamas into calling off their attacks. But even if this ceasefire holds, damage has been done, lives have been lost, resentments have deepened, and a lasting peace deal seems as far away as ever. So let's look back on some of the major developments before we get you some expert analysis from a former US ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. Last weekend, Israel drew international criticism for targeting a building in Gaza housing media organisations, including the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, only giving a few minutes' notice to evacuate before drone and airstrikes brought the building down. Israel has yet to provide any public evidence to support its claim that that building also contained a Hamas operations centre.
In a statement, Al Jazeera said it condemned in the strongest terms the bombing and destruction of its offices by the Israeli military, viewing it as a clear act to stop journalists from conducting their duty to inform the world and report events.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken sent Israel a please explain and says they have received some further information through intelligence channels, whatever that means. Also on Saturday, an Israeli airstrike on a house in a Gaza City refugee camp killed 10 members of one extended family, 8 of them children. On Sunday, 40 Palestinians, including at least 10 children, were killed in another Israeli airstrike that destroyed several homes. Palestinian officials say at least 132 buildings in Gaza have been destroyed and more than 200 people have been killed. Gaza's desalination plant is out of commission, creating water shortages. The power is repeatedly being knocked out, and Gaza's only COVID testing clinic has reportedly been made inoperable after an Israeli airstrike against a neighbouring building sent shrapnel and debris into it from across the street. That all matters because less than 2% of Gazans have been vaccinated against COVID, compared to more than 50% of Israelis. More than 3,000 rockets have been fired by Hamas militants into Israel. Most, but not all, have been intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome missile defence system. At least 10 people have been killed by unguided Hamas rockets hitting Israel, 2 of them children. A small number of rockets have also been fired into Israel from Lebanon, which threatened to further escalate the conflict.
Yeah, I think the thing with bombing the AP Al Jazeera building is not that it's hard to believe there might have been some militants located in the building. It's that Israel's bombed the premises of 23 different Palestinian and international media outlets just in the past week. So people are starting to see a pattern. That's why Reporters Without Borders requested an ICC investigation into possible war crimes having been committed. Now, it is possible that every one of those buildings might have housed Hamas militants. Israel does claim that Hamas deliberately places their military assets in sensitive areas like those ones. But you can see why after a while people would be anxious to see some public evidence and not just more nudging and winking with the CIA. Anyway, moving on to the ceasefire. It's hard to know exactly what role, if any, Biden might have played in this process because, as John hinted at, he has a long history of having frank words with Netanyahu, but behind the scenes. Either way, Biden would be desperately hoping that this ceasefire holds because he's been walking a real tightrope here through the internal politics of the Democratic Party. In this week's YouGov poll, 33% of Americans said that their sympathies were more with the Israelis compared to 15% who said their sympathies were with the Palestinians. For Republicans, it was even more lopsided, with 61% supporting the Israelis to 5% supporting the Palestinians. But look at the Democrats, 16% supporting the Israelis to 23% supporting the Palestinians, and a whopping 35% of them saying that their sympathies were equal. So, it's quite a delicate balancing act there for Biden. In fact, 25 House Democrats even sent Biden a letter asking him to condemn the looming evictions of Palestinians in East Jerusalem and suggesting that he immediately send Israel his strongest diplomatic message, which might be why Biden was so gentle with Democrat Rashida Tlaib after she confronted him about his attitude towards the conflict the other day. This clip was a little later on.
I tell you what, Rashid, I want to say to you that I admire your intellect, I admire your passion, and I admire your concern for so many other people. And it's from my heart, I pray that your grandmom and family are well. I promise you I'm going to do everything to see that they are on the West Bank. You're a fighter, and God, thank you for being a fighter.
Very diplomatic indeed. I think the ceasefire might have saved the Democrats from some real division, at least for now.
Yes, we'll see how long for now it turns out to be. Even though this ceasefire is both mutual and unconditional, Hamas is claiming to have won concessions from Israel on contentious points, including Israel's attempted eviction of several Palestinian families from East Jerusalem, which of course was one of the triggers of this conflict. An Israeli court ruling on that next month, though, could provide another potential flashpoint check.
Sure could. But now for the expert that you promised, John, we are joined by Daniel Kurtzer. He's the former US ambassador to Israel under George W. Bush and to Egypt during the Clinton administration. Ambassador Kurtzer, welcome to Planet America.
My pleasure.
Mr. Ambassador, we've heard a bit about a real estate dispute being the cause of this current conflict. I was hoping you could shed some light on that. Is it true that in Jerusalem, a Palestinian family that lives where a Jewish family used to be before they were dispossessed in 1948 can now be evicted from that property, but it doesn't work the other way around? A Jewish family cannot be evicted if they are where a Palestinian family used to be before they were dispossessed.
Well, as most of these issues are, it's complicated. There is a law on the books in Israel that says the Palestinians to remain in properties which had Jewish owners before 1948, provided that they're paying rent. Extremist settlers have been trying to find properties in which they can prove Jewish ownership, and they tried to prove that rent was not being paid. And the courts have, in some cases, upheld this maneuver, which actually dispossesses the Palestinian residents. It doesn't work in the other direction. Palestinians who had homes inside pre-1948 Palestine are not allowed to sue anywhere, especially in Israeli courts, to try to regain their property. Those properties are maintained by a custodian of absentee properties.
So is it your expectation that this conflict could lead to a resolution of those underlying issues, or is that a bit too much to hope for?
Well, we wish it were the case, but it hasn't happened in previous altercations between Israel and Hamas, and it won't happen this time. But in this particular iteration, it's going to be important to go back to what started it. And it was this dispute over properties in Jerusalem from which Palestinians were being dispossessed, and very heavy-handed actions by the Israeli police, including acting during Ramadan, the holy month for Muslims, on the Haram al-Sharif, the holy esplanade, where the Mosque of Al-Aqsa is located. So if all that happens is you end this conflict with a ceasefire, we're still going to be in deep trouble. There has to be a second stage of getting at these more serious underlying issues.
What effect do you think America's lack of an ambassador to Israel has had on America's ability to influence the conflicts?
Oh, I think it's been a serious drawback. It's not only the ambassador. We don't have a consul general in Jerusalem anymore to deal with the Palestinians. We don't have an assistant secretary of state in the State Department that deals with the Middle East. So there's real a lack of personnel, an absence of personnel to help try to deal with this. You know, I served as a deputy assistant secretary, and I know both the advantages of that position and the limitations. And the fact that there is a deputy assistant secretary as the only person dealing with this suggests that it's a serious problem in Washington, including the absence of an ambassador.
Mr. Ambassador, the United States still does not deal directly with Hamas. It categorises it as a terrorist organisation. But 15 years now after Hamas won elections in Gaza, is it time for that to change? After all, America does talk to a lot of people they don't particularly like.
Well, it's not just the United States. The so-called quartet, the United Nations, the European Union, and Russia have joined together with the United States in saying that Hamas must change at least in three ways: renounce terrorism, recognize Israel, and accept agreements into which the Palestinian Authority had entered. So there is a consensus that Hamas needs to change its ways. The real question is whether or not one can hold out for 100% change, or whether one can incentivize some change along the way to hopefully help Hamas make some adjustments. But so far, there's been pretty firm rejection of dealing with Hamas, and that's not likely to change as a result of this latest fighting.
Isn't there a greater problem here with Hamas in that they don't actually represent the people of Gaza? Well, what, 12 years overdue for an election in Gaza, and polls suggest that if the election was held, Hamas could well lose. So is it possible to have fruitful negotiations when at least one side in that negotiation has no legitimate representation?
You're exactly right. Hamas is a part of a very serious internal Palestinian political conundrum. The Palestinian political system is geographically split between the West Bank and Gaza. It is politically split between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. But even within Hamas, there is a military wing in Gaza and a political wing. There's Hamas in the West Bank, there's Hamas in the camps in Lebanon, and there's an external Hamas leadership that works out of Qatar. And it's very hard for them to communicate, and therefore it's hard for them to take decisions. So the absence of elections hits everybody very hard. I think part of Hamas's reasoning this time around was its frustration that Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, had canceled elections, which may have given Hamas a little bit of a leg up in the battle for supremacy.
Of course, Joe Biden has been around foreign policy circles for a very, very long time now, and he's had a long time, therefore, to think about possible solutions to the Israel-Palestinian question. If he could wave a magic wand as President of the United States now, what do you think he would like to do?
Well, I think, after 35 or 37 years in the Senate, Biden's views are pretty well known. He is a classic two-stater, believes that the outcome should be two states living side by side. He supports Israel's right to exist and its right of self-defense. He supports Palestinian rights of self-determination. But you also have to take into account that by the time he became president, he inherited a terrible mess. Not all of it left behind by his predecessor, but a lot of it exacerbated by the policies of his predecessor. And so dealing with these domestic challenges is really taking up almost all of Biden's bandwidth. And not only that, but in a kind of positive sense, I think Biden has started to see himself as a transformational president. In other words, not just fixing what needs repair, but maybe changing the way America thinks about itself and operates with respect to relations between blacks and whites, between rich and poor, equalizing the burden better with different kind of tax system. And I think Biden has grasped this possibility of transforming America during what he hopes would be 2 terms. And that has really directed his attention away from the area that he did know best, which was foreign affairs.
In your view, Mr. Ambassador, is there any hope left for a potential 2-state solution with Israel? And if so, how do you get there?
The reality is there isn't an alternative. All the alternatives are challenged either by a lack of support by Israel or a lack of support by Palestinians, or the unworkability. For example, a 1-state solution can't work. Look at what's happening now between Israelis and Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but even inside Israel, where Jewish and Arab citizens are at each other's throats. So you look at all of these alternatives, and it's romantic to think that there's some other outcome out there that might work. And you always come back to partition, that these 2 peoples need to call some part of Palestine their home, to establish a sovereign state, and then to develop ways of interacting through economics and tourism and trade and all the rest. So it's not that I'm a believer idealistically, but rather practically. How to get there? It's leadership. We don't have it in Israel. We don't have it in Palestine. And we don't have the kind of determined leadership outside, including in Washington, that wants to make this a top priority issue.
Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, thank you very much for being with us on Planet America.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A push by Democrats to establish an independent, bipartisan 9/11-style commission to investigate January's attacks on the US Capitol is struggling to win over enough Republican support to overcome the filibuster and pass the Senate. Negotiations between House Democrats and Republicans reached agreement earlier this week for a commission to be evenly split between representatives from both parties. But then House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy withdrew his support, as did Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell. McCarthy wanted the commission's scope to be expanded beyond the January 6th insurrection by a pro-Trump mob to include last year's riots following the police murder of George Floyd. A view which, not coincidentally, echoes that of former President Donald Trump, who says this commission is a
Democrat trap
and
more partisan unfairness.
He says
Republicans must get much tougher and much smarter.
And that
hopefully Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy are listening.
And they seem to be listening, although McConnell's argument is a little more nuanced. It wouldn't be a truly bipartisan commission, he says, because Democrats would have a final say on staffing decisions, and besides, police and prosecutors have already laid hundreds of charges and congressional committees are already investigating.
It's not at all clear what new facts or additional investigation yet another commission could actually lay on top of existing efforts by law enforcement and Congress.
The debate in the House did reveal divisions within Republican ranks between those who want a full accounting of the Capitol attack and those who pretty much want to put it all behind them and move on. The bill to create a commission passed by 252 to 175, 217 Democrats and 35 Republicans voting in favour.
The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Part of the reason Republicans like Kevin McCarthy may want to move on, their own role in inciting the Capitol attack, with comments like this just 2 days after the election.
President Trump won this election, so everyone who's listening, do not be quiet. Do not be silent about this. We cannot allow this to happen before our very eyes.
Yeah, McCarthy might want to forget that one. But I reckon if McCarthy does have personal reasons for not supporting the commission, it might be more related to this.
Should Kevin McCarthy be willing to testify before that commission? After all, he is one of the few people that we know of that was actually talking to Donald Trump while the attack was taking place.
He absolutely should, and I wouldn't be surprised if he were subpoenaed.
And it's answers like that that explain why Kevin McCarthy has had enough of Liz Cheney. But there are plenty of other reasons that Republicans have given for not supporting the commission. The number 4 Republican in the Senate, Roy Blunt, said that he thought the commission could get in the way of Congress's ongoing inquiry into the police response on January 6. He worried it would slow down their efforts to implement Capitol Police reform. The number 3 Republican in the Senate, John Thune, had probably a more honest take, though, in that he flat out admitted he had political concerns. He said the findings of the probe could be weaponised against Republicans and dragged into the 2022 midterms. He said anything that gets us rehashing the 2020 elections is a day lost on being able to draw a contrast between us and the radical socialist Democrats, etc., etc. You know the drill. And old mate Kevin McCarthy made a rather honest appraisal of his own of the dangers of commissions back in 2015 when he said this about Hillary Clinton.
Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping. Why? Because she's untrustable. But no one would have known any of that had happened had we not thought and made that happen.
That's something good. I give you credit for that.
Never say the truth on air, you'll always regret it. So, if the Senate Republicans reject the commission, they'll have their reasons. I say if because, remember, 7 senators voted to remove Trump as president because of the events of January 6. So it'd be strange if they didn't want a full accounting of what happened on January 6. And assuming all Democrats vote for the commission, that just leaves 3 more Republican votes to beat the filibuster. But stranger things have happened, like how it was a Republican, John Katko, that agreed to the terms of this commission in the first place. Now, conservative media has already noted that Katko was one of the Republicans who voted for Trump's impeachment the second time round. But apparently Katko was personally asked by Kevin McCarthy to be the negotiator, and Katko was right across what McCarthy wanted to happen. So someone stuffed up somewhere along the line. It's also strange to me that Mitch McConnell is so worried about this commission in the first place. After all, it's been set up so that if Republicans want it to fail, it will fail, because the commission really can't do very much without either an agreement between the Democrat and Republican chairpeople or through a majority vote of committee members. In other words, if Republicans want to sabotage it, they can. So they might as well go through the motions, John.
Unless they just don't want to get caught in the process of committing it. It's the other way to look at it. Now, to the issue of the Havana Syndrome. The name itself suggests Cold War-style intrigue. It is a mysterious illness causing brain injury to over 130 American spies, diplomats, soldiers and other personnel overseas.
And the latest alleged case occurred only 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and the first episodes were identified in Havana, Cuba back in 2016, hence the name. US Embassy staff at the time were suffering unusual symptoms after hearing what they described as a loud noise. They experienced pain in one or both ears or across a broad region of their head, in some cases head pressure or vibration, dizziness, then tinnitus, visual problems, vertigo and cognitive difficulties. Since then, similar cases have been reported amongst US personnel in China and Europe as well. And this week came reports that Havana Syndrome had been experienced just outside the White House.
At the president's doorstep, 2 mysterious incidents that have intelligence officials scrambling. Multiple sources tell CNN tonight 2 White House officials were struck by a mysterious illness. One hit while they were near an entrance to the White House grounds. The other while they were passing through a gate near the Ellipse on the south side of the White House.
Those victims were officials with the National Security Council, reportedly. And this attack took place in November last year.
And now there's scuttlebutt that while there is no smoking gun linking Russia's military intelligence unit, the GRU, to the suspected incidents, the GRU does have a known footprint in each of the locations where an incident occurred. And they are the only Russian agency that has the technology to potentially pull off such attacks. Quote, "It looks, smells and feels like the GRU," said one former spook to Politico.
Yeah, that is definitely the suspicion. An investigation by the National Academies of Science concluded the reported symptoms were consistent with RF or radio frequency effects, although some experts have expressed doubts about that, pointing out there is no evidence that a microwave weapon actually exists.
Yeah, and they also raise questions that if a directed microwave beam was fired at someone's head, you'd expect to see visible effects on the skin and flesh, but there have been no such markings in Havana Syndrome cases.
Yeah, still, there are few if any doubts that the symptoms themselves exist, and in some cases those symptoms have been long-lasting and severely debilitating. Mark Zaid is a lawyer representing some of the US defence personnel affected by Havana Syndrome. He's no stranger to the world of espionage or diplomacy. He represented the whistleblower who sounded the alarm at President Trump's quid pro quo pressure on Ukraine to dig dirt on the Bidens in 2019, leading, of course, to his first impeachment. Mark Zaid, welcome to Planet America.
It's my pleasure.
We've been talking about Havana Syndrome, and I understand that you're not crazy about we in the media using that phrase, Havana Syndrome. Why is that?
I am not, because Havana Syndrome is a fake, easy-to-use name that actually doesn't reflect what the issue is. The issue is this mysterious directed energy weapons, whether it's microwaves or something else. But Havana was just one location where this incident happened. It just happened to be the sort of largest and most public of the incidents, so that's what got the media attention. But I've been working on this issue for years prior to Havana, involving other countries, other locations, other government agencies.
So what would you have us call it instead?
You know, it's a hard thing, because right now it is such a mystery. I usually go by sort of mystery energy-directed weapon thing. We don't really know what this is yet.
I'm going to call it Havana Syndrome then. So tell us, whatever we call it, what is it? How do you and your clients identify what could be a result of their service being exposed to whatever this mystery weapon is, or whatever this thing is, as opposed to something else that could be happening in their life, to their water supply, their Wi-Fi, whatever else?
So it is a very complicated story. And what makes it even more difficult is that many people have different effects, assuming they are even suffering from the same thing. For one thing, the key thing to understand is sort of what I alluded to. This has been going on for decades, at least with Americans. And I dare say I'm shocked if there are no Australian, British, French, German. We know there are Canadian cases from Havana as well. But if the culprit is or are the Russians, the former Soviets back in the day, and possibly other Eastern Bloc Soviet-related countries, I can't imagine it's not being directed at the primary allies, sort of the Five Eyes and the closer Western allies. And we know a lot less than what we know about, which is, you know, a bad way to say we have far more questions than answers. And the issue is that, at least from the effects, it would generally be massive nausea, massive headaches, migraines, very focused, possibly sound, not necessarily, loss of balance, memory problems.
Mark, you hit on what I think is a key question in this whole issue, which is assuming it came from the same source. Because there is such a wide range of symptoms, what makes you think that largely this has come from the same source?
So I'm hesitant to even say that. I stay very focused, and every case is different. What happened to my clients in Russia, and there are some that it happened to in Russia, what happened to them in Havana and Cuba, what happened to them in China, could all be different. And I would suspect that clients of mine that were hit 20, 30 years ago, and the people we know were hit even before that, there's probably a difference then versus now, because perhaps the technology has changed. What we can at least do is try and identify something that seems different within the individual through certain types of scans, CAT scans, PET scans, MRIs, anything. This has essentially been looked at as a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, just like what might happen to our combat soldiers and others who are in the field and they are near an explosion, but the explosion doesn't physically injure them, doesn't rip off a limb or anything of the sort, but the impact of the concussion of the shock wave significantly damages their brain.
Mark, is it your sense that the US government knows what this weapon or whatever is causing this effect is, or is it a mystery to them as well?
I imagine it's a little bit of both, but I will say I do not believe, having worked with the intelligence agencies for literally 30 years, and that's what my law practice is, representing people who work at the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, every three-letter agency that you see in movies and on television. I do not believe that they are unaware of what has been happening. And we know of CIA evidence, documents that are classified, so I don't have them, but my client had access to them, that date back into the 1990s that said an enemy, an adversary was using a microwave-style weapon. How or why, that's not known, but that they were using it was known.
Certainly in the media articles about this syndrome in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of speculation that the CIA believe Russia is involved in some capacity with some of these recent attacks. Do you know why they think that?
I mean, it makes the most logical sense. And it is the type of tactic that the Soviets and the Russians as successors would do. So if this was not a weapon designed to kill, and I hope that's not what the intent is, but let's say it was designed and believed to just cause headaches, to cause nausea, to cause a loss of balance, interfere with the daily business of an intelligence officer, just to screw with them and harass them. What made it different in Havana was that it was not spies that were hit. There were spies that were hit, but they were just regular diplomats that usually are off ground, so to speak. These aren't the ones that you target.
Mark, if reports that we've heard this week are correct, that a couple of White House employees were targeted in November last year, that raises the spectre not just of the individual harm that has been caused to members of the US government, but that this could be a weapon that could potentially be deployed against the President of the United States or senior administration officials in a moment of crisis or conflict. This would seem to have massive national security implications.
Absolutely. As far as we can tell, we have no defensive mechanism against this. And one of the things that has bothered me so much is not just, okay, who is it? What country is doing this, or countries are doing this to our citizens and others, and why, and what can be done about that. But if what I believe is true, and the US government has known about this for so long, why hasn't it done anything to publicize it? Why hasn't it done anything to deal with the victims and treat them? Because I can tell you it has not done that prior to the last few years. Why has it not done anything that we know of to respond or retaliate against this country? That really bothers me.
Mark Zaid, we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
1/3 of American adults say they believe at least some of the sightings of unidentified flying objects over the years have been alien spacecraft visiting the Earth. 16% say they have personally seen a UFO, and, perhaps more importantly, almost 70% say the government knows more about UFOs than it's letting on. But that may be about to change. Hidden in last year's second massive COVID relief bill was an order that the Director of National Intelligence work with the Defence Department to reveal detailed analysis of unidentified aerial phenomena data and intelligence. That report is expected in June. The renewed push came after the Navy declassified some remarkable footage which had their own pilots scratching their heads.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
Trump's Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, says this release will include some sightings that defy easy explanation.
Frankly, there are a lot more sightings than have been made public. Some of those have been declassified. When we talk about sightings, we're talking about objects that have been seen by Navy or Air Force pilots or have been picked up by satellite imagery that, frankly, engage in actions that are difficult to explain.
How America responds to this impending report in this age of fake news and choose your own facts is anybody's guess, but history suggests things could get a little bit out of hand. In the American summer of 1947, the Second World War had been over for almost 2 years, but it was an uneasy peace. Following the defeat of fascism, the alliance of convenience between Western democracies and communist Russia had collapsed.
Soviet Russia was expensively stabbing westward, knifing into nations left empty by war.
The United States had used atomic bombs to defeat Japan, but worried how long it would be alone in having the weapon. In this new Cold War, the US cast itself as the defender of freedom, even if that meant a Third World War.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
In America, paranoia was growing about communist infiltration of unions, the entertainment industry, and the military and government itself. And in that summer of 1947, some very peculiar stories started to appear.
Reports that strange flying discs have been whizzing at 1,200 miles an hour over the western United States.
And 3 days later,
8 flying saucers described as more like wash tubs and each about the size of a 5-bedroom house were reported today.
Further south in New Mexico, a 48-year-old rancher named Mac Brazel had made a rather unusual discovery. A large area of wreckage including rubber strips, tin foil, a rather tough paper and sticks. Mac Brazel had heard the reports of flying discs and wondered if the debris he'd found had something to do with that. He spoke to the local sheriff, George Wilcox, who in turn contacted the nearby Roswell Army Airfield. An intelligence officer named Jesse Marcel went with Brazel and Wilcox to the crash site and recovered more material. The following day, the Roswell Army Airfield, known as the RAAF, issued an eye-catching statement.
The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bombing Group of the 8th Air Force Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chavez County.
The next day's Roswell Daily Record embellished that a bit with the headline, RAAF capture flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The word disc was mysterious enough, but flying saucer suggested a visitor from another planet. Remember, it was only 9 years since actor Orson Welles had broadcast a radio play about a fictional Martian invasion that had caused something of a panic.
Of the creatures in the rocket cylinder at Grover's Mill, I can give you no authoritative information either as to their nature, their origin, or their purposes here on Earth.
How many people really believe they were hearing news of a Martian attack is still debated. It may have just been a bit of a beat-up, but it was enough to cause Orson Welles to apologise.
Of course, we are deeply shocked and deeply regretful about the results of last night's broadcast.
After the Roswell incident, hundreds of other reports of UFOs and flying saucers came flooding in. The next day, the US Army changed its story, saying it was a harmless, high-altitude weather balloon, not a grounded flying disc. Still, Mac Brazel said that he'd picked up bits of weather balloons before, and that's not what he found this time, but he was tired of all the fuss and he let it rest, as did most people, until 1994, when the US government finally revealed Mac was right. It was not a weather balloon. It wasn't a Martian spaceship either. The report said that the Roswell debris was part of a different kind of balloon, one used in the top-secret Project Mogul. Essentially an airborne bugging device to listen out for possible Soviet nuclear tests and missile launches. It included a chain of high-altitude balloons and large kite-like radar targets for tracking. It was one of those kites that Mac Brazel found, and probably explains a number of similar sightings like that string of flying wash tubs. Lots of other secret weapons, rockets, planes and nuclear devices were all being tested around that time in New Mexico and nearby Nevada. Decades later, alleged witnesses claimed that they'd even seen aliens being whisked away by the military. Officials said they were parachute test dummies. To this day, some believe a spaceship did come down at Roswell and all of the evidence about foil and paper balloons was faked. But the real mystery may be, why did the Roswell Army Air Force initially fuel speculation about discs? Was it misinformation designed to distract from Project Mogul? Did they intend to cause a panic? Was it a mistake, a failed joke, or could it just possibly have been the truth and quickly covered up? Last year, President Trump was asked about Roswell in an interview with his son, Don Jr., and he seemed faintly amused and probably more concerned about tourism than extraterrestrials.
Would you ever open up Roswell and let us know what's really going on there?
So many people ask me that question.
I know, it sounds almost ridiculous, but it's actually the real question I want to know.
It sounds like a cute question, but it's actually, there are millions and millions of people that want to go there, that want to see it. I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting. But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
So, we may be about to find out what's going on and ultimately what the American public chooses to believe. This week, many Americans were ripping off their face masks in public for the first time in many, many months after the Centers for Disease Control announced vaccinated people no longer need them because data shows vaccinated people rarely transmit the virus and the shots are effective against variants. President Biden then took a bit of a victory lap.
I think it's a great milestone, a great day. It's been made possible by the extraordinary success we've had in vaccinating so many Americans so quickly.
And at first it came as generally very welcome news.
Today is the first time I've been walking just down the sidewalk with no mask, and it feels great.
Well, I've always been against masks.
I'm ready for anything, and I'm vaccinated, so I feel pretty confident.
But that confidence quickly turned to doubt and confusion, because CDC guidance is one thing, but in much of America, mask mandates are still in place.
22 states still have some sort of mask mandate in place. The mixed messaging causing confusion.
And 2/3 of Americans are still to be fully vaccinated anyway. And you still have to wear a mask if your city, state, workplace, or the store you're in mandates it.
We are asking people to take their health into their own hands, to get vaccinated, and if they don't, then they continue to be at risk.
So the message now from the CDC is, if you don't want to wear a mask, get vaccinated. But the question then is, who is going to check whether people taking off their masks have actually been vaccinated? Chaz, this probably didn't roll out quite as smoothly as Joe Biden would have been hoping, methinks.
I'm certain it didn't, John. Firstly, it was a bit suboptimal that the CDC kept this recommendation quiet for 3 days. They actually approved the recommendation last Monday, but they kept it quiet despite the director of the CDC testifying to the Senate Health Committee on Tuesday, where she insisted that the administration's already secretly defunct guidelines were actually correct. Biden himself wasn't even briefed on the new guidelines until last Thursday. So that was all very weird. Also not ideal was that the CDC made a point to note that there were exceptions to these guidelines. Even vaccinated people were still supposed to wear masks in doctors' offices, on public transport, at airports, as well as this fairly important point.
We have really encouraged that the policies of mask wearing be locally driven, and the reason for that is because every community, every county has different rates of disease and different rates of vaccination.
Locally driven mask policies. As John said before, they made a big point of that, but no one seemed to absorb that. The takeaway was just pandemic over. Woo! That's why a bunch of CDC supporters on TV were really not happy.
Essentially, the CDC today eliminated mask mandates and social distancing. They're saying it's all an honor code from now on. And so I really worry about those people who cannot yet be vaccinated, like our children, the individuals who are immunocompromised and are not fully protected by the vaccine. We're now putting them at risk, and I think bringing us actually even further from reaching herd immunity.
To put this in context, only a week ago, the New York Times surveyed a bunch of epidemiologists about how long they expected vaccinated Americans to be wearing masks indoors around strangers. 52% of the epidemiologists said they expected to be wearing a mask for more than a year. 81% of them expected to be wearing a mask for a year or more. And 1 week later, the CDC is telling them, don't worry, it's cool. And you know, in some states, it probably is cool, even by epidemiologists' absurdly high standards. Maine, Connecticut, Vermont, Rhode Island and Massachusetts are all at either 50% of the population fully vaccinated or damn close to it. And that was basically the point where Israel defeated COVID. So those states are probably approaching herd immunity. But Utah, Tennessee, Louisiana, Georgia, Arkansas, Alabama and Mississippi, and a whole lot of other states, by the way, aren't even close. And many of those places are about to get very hot in the American summer, which could drive people indoors and potentially lead to another COVID surge. In fact, red states in general, they're the states to the right of the graph there, tend to be very poorly vaccinated at the moment. They're low dots. And I don't think that's about to change regardless of what the CDC says. Making things even more concerning for the experts, a number of red states aren't even letting virus-heavy counties impose their own mask mandates. Texas, for example, isn't letting any government entity impose a mask mandate, even though only 33% of Texans are currently fully vaccinated. And this is particularly concerning to health professionals because vaccination numbers are really starting to drop off. Look at that black line on the graph there. That's a 7-day average. Daily results are down to about 1.5 million doses. The 7-day average is down to 1.8 million doses per day. That's the lowest level since March the 1st. Cue a whole bunch of desperate measures to entice some more vaccinations. Over in Ohio, they've started a lottery for people getting vaccinated, giving away $1 million every week for 5 weeks to people getting vaccinated. And that's only bought them a small increase in vaccination numbers, $1 million. Over in New York, they're offering a whole suite of perks, including these.
Free fries when you get vaccinated. I got vaccinated. You're saying I could get this? These delicious fries? Wait a minute. But there's also a burger element to this? If this is appealing to you, just think of this when you think of vaccination. Vaccination. I'm getting a very good feeling about vaccination right this moment.
I'm not. So there you have it, a free burger, and with that clip there, you also get a free nightmare.
Yes, it's time for a rather different fireside chat, Chaz. We are going to be talking a lot about aliens and UFOs for the next couple of weeks, I think.
And I've never felt safer than I do right now.
Yeah, the voices have stopped. It's unbelievable. But look, on a serious note, the lesson from the Roswell incident in the 1940s was that the American government would rather have people believe the possibility of flying saucers and little green men than to reveal a mundane but important top secret surveillance weapon that was being used in the Cold War against Russia. Now, one explanation that is being explored at the moment is that China or Russia, one of America's rivals, potential enemies, is deploying some kind of surveillance drone that has movement capacities that are inexplicable to American technology. Now, that's going to be a mundane suggestion. Others are saying, you know what? Statistically, it's almost certain that there are going to be aliens that have got better technology than us, and maybe they're sending little probes to Earth just as we're sending little rovers off to Mars. What do you reckon?
Well, look, there's going to be a report on, they're saying June 1, they might push it back, we'll see. We'll find it soon enough. I find it not hard to believe that there could be aliens. I'm not sure they'd make their way to Earth. I'd probably stay well
Why
away
would
from
they
Earth.
bother?
Exactly. But anyway, we'll find out soon enough. The interesting thing is how people are going to react.
That's extraordinary.
If there is some kind of evidence of alien interaction.
Right, so it threatens people's sense of security either way, but it potentially leads to a Cold War kind of a situation if there is a threatening international weapon out there. If it is something inexplicable from somewhere not Earth, if that's the conclusion, then it has all sorts of philosophical, theological, all sorts of questions. And I don't really think America is well suited right now for a profoundly kind of earth-shattering revelation.
That's probably true. But having said that, I do think we've seen one of the lessons of the last few years is that even when there is something right in front of your face, if people are in denial, they stay in denial. And I reckon even if there is smoking gun evidence of aliens coming to Earth, I think most the people who aren't ready for it aren't going to believe it.
That would be the most depressing outcome of all. Okay, for now, tinfoil hats off and onto the more mundane earthly matters of the United States Supreme Court. We've been talking for a couple of years, ever since Donald Trump got 3 Conservative justices onto the Supreme Court, that there is going to be a push to relitigate Roe versus Wade, which expanded abortion access. That case may well have just arrived.
Yep, Dobbs versus Jackson, Women's Health, I think it's called. Mississippi have a ban on abortions after 15 weeks. Roe versus Wade says that you're not supposed to have any restrictions before viability, which is between 23 and 24 weeks pregnancy. So that's clearly against the law as it stands. Mississippi, when they were sued, when that went to court, they didn't even try to defend it. They just said, we'll just appeal.
It seems like this law was actually put forward in the hope that somebody would challenge it and take it to the Supreme Court in an attempt to make, therefore, if the Supreme Court rules in favour of this law, it doesn't just change Mississippi, it changes America.
Well, there are I've forgotten the number, but it's like 11 or 12 states at the very least have what they call trigger laws that as soon as abortion becomes legal under certain circumstances, illegal under certain circumstances, it will be illegal in those states immediately.
Right.
Like that, so they're ready to go. The interesting thing about this is it takes 4 Supreme Court justices out of 9 to choose to hear a case. They first had this case come up in September, and they chose to do nothing at the time in September. And for the last 8 months, they've been postponing it and postponing it and postponing it. You ask why? And the speculation is that behind the scenes, they're doing the numbers. The Supreme Court, because the Conservative justices don't want to bring it up unless they're going to win. And so the fact they now have said, let's hear it, is a sign. If I was an abortion activist, I wouldn't be very optimistic about where this is going.
This does assume, though, of course, that the justices are going to vote on their ideology and their assumed position on abortion rather than on the legal or constitutional merits of this case.
If they weren't, why are they hearing the case? Because it's so clearly against the law, and all the lower courts have already said, that's against the law. So they're hearing it for a reason.
Meanwhile, it does put potentially abortion very much on the agenda for next year's congressional midterm elections. And a lot of Democrats will, even though they'll be concerned about potentially limits on women's access to abortion at 14 weeks or 12 weeks, they will also know that this is going to get the women that have been voting for Democrats for the last couple of election cycles, will get them angry and get them out to vote next year.
Yeah, the verdict is due in the middle of next year. So it will be right in the middle of election season. Having said that, for exactly that reason, if you're a cynic, you would suggest, you would suggest that the Supreme Court would be unlikely to just go bang, repeal Roe versus Wade entirely. They'd be unlikely to do that for exactly that reason. It could become a massive election.
So this could be a stepping stone towards an overturning of Roe versus Wade rather than just toss it out.
Yeah, they would open a loophole that the red states would then barge through.
Okay, well, that's going to be a big issue as well. A number of other court cases that we're keeping a close eye on at the moment as well, including some charges being dropped and a guilty plea from Joel Greenberg, Matt Gaetz' buddy down in Florida. It looks as though the prosecutors are really targeting Matt Gaetz on this, and also Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization. He is now the subject of a criminal probe in New York, and we could see a similar process there where the small fish, they do a plea deal, they go up to the big fish, and, well, we'll see how that all plays out. That's going to be fascinating as well, but we are out of time for another very busy week on Planet America. You can find us on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube as well.
And there's a brand new pet podcast right there, but as we cross our fingers for the ceasefire in Israel, we will leave you with some vision of where the Gaza-Israeli conflict really took its toll. in the studios of Fox News.
Good night.
You play this emotional game with the audience and use your position of responsibility to put out misinformation and
stop
BS.
Attacking
you did it
me,
on the
punk.
police thing.
Address
where
the issue. Do you have the guts to address the issue and not address? This is not about me. You didn't come on this show to attack me.
Yourself.
You came on the show to talk about the issue.
Because again,
do you have a point about the issue?
Using your position of authority.
I'm sick of you, Bongino.
I'm
sick of you.
That are absolutely outrageous.
Geraldo,
You're
let
an
him talk.
uncontrolled lunatic.
Geraldo,
I'm sorry.
let him talk.
Geraldo Rivera does not understand that Hamas doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist. Hamas wants the Jews dead. And what does he do? The same thing with the police issue. He makes this an emotional thing.